Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here. And the first question is, who runs the world? Is it Beyoncé? Is it Taylor Swift? Is it tech billionaires or broligarchs? To be honest, I'm not sure about that. I don't know. I won't answer that today. However, I'll answer the question, who runs the World Wide Web? WSIS+20 and the future of internet governance. My assumption for this talk is that the internet is inherently political. So whether it's the governance on the internet or off the internet, every single layer of the open systems interconnection model that you can see here in a very simplified way is political and entrenched with politics. And I'm quoting Rebecca McKinnon here about her book, The Consent of the Network. She said, "We cannot assume that the internet will evolve automatically in a direction that is going to be compatible with democracy. It depends on how the technology is structured, governed, and used. Governments and corporations are working actively to shape the internet to fit their own needs." So who am I and why am I talking about all of this? So first of all, I'm a huge Beyoncé fan, so that's why I put up the first slide. And otherwise, I'm also working as a project manager in the public policy team of Wikimedia Germany. And I'm really passionate about international digital policy. And here you can also see me at my first Internet Governance Forum back in 2022 in Ethiopia. And also, this is my first Congress, so really please bear with me. And I'll guide you through the following structure. So I'll start off with WSIS+20, a huge acronym, and then I'll take you back in a time capsule 20 years ago, and then I'll continue with talking about internet governance, the multi-stakeholder approach, and also the Global Digital Compact. And then I'll end with the ones who held the actual power about the internet, standards and norms. And then we'll end with a small glimpse into the future. And yeah, my first question to all of you, by a show of hands, who has ever heard about WSIS or WSIS+20? Okay, so there's a lot to explain here. Who has ever heard about the Internet Governance Forum? Also by show of hands. Okay, that's a couple of more people, nice. Who has ever been to an Internet Governance Forum? Okay, so a few very advanced pro experts in the room. Okay, nice. Here in the picture, you can see German Minister for Digital Carsten Wildberger delivering a speech at the WSIS+20 review of the UN General Assembly 2 weeks ago in New York. So WSIS+20 in brief, basically the World Summit on the Information Society happened between 2003 and 2005, and it was really the first point in time where the United Nations were like, this internet thing, I think we need to do something about it. So this was really this first global process on digital technologies. And they developed a vision of a people-centered, inclusive, and development-oriented information society. But this was all 20 years ago. So I looked at some very old videos from 2003 and 2005, because at the Chaos Communication Congress, WSIS already played a role back in the days, because a couple of people that are definitely still around here talked about WSIS back then in 2003 at 20C3 and also in 2005 at 22C3. And yeah, basically explained what the experience as civil society was at WSIS back in the days. So now, in detail, what is WSIS? It's a process, basically. So it all started in 1998 at the ITU. They were like, okay, this internet thing, we need to do something about it, information society. And also in 1998, ICANN, so the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, was founded. And then in 2001, finally, the UN General Assembly was like, okay, a couple of different organizations should come together and organize a summit, so the World Summit on the Information Society. And they gave the mandate to a couple of very different organizations, so ITU, UNDP, but also UNESCO or the UN Environment Programme. And then it continued in 2003. There was the first WSIS phase in Geneva. And then they developed the Geneva Declaration and the Action Plan. And through that, they also developed the so-called WSIS action lines. Also a solidarity fund, especially to help the majority world to also catch up with technologies. And then also they founded a working group on internet governance. And their main job was actually to define what internet governance is. So that was a pretty big job. And then 2 years later, they all came together again in the second WSIS phase in Tunis this time. And there they developed the Tunis Commitment and Agenda. So then they finally had a definition in 2005 of what internet governance is, and then they also talked about enhanced cooperation and also founded the Internet Governance Forum and gave it a mandate. And then 10 years after that, there was the first WSIS review, so the WSIS+20 review, and then the Internet Governance Forum mandate was again prolonged for 10 years. And then the same thing happened 10 years later, the WSIS+20 review, so now to 2025, we now have the Internet Governance Forum as a permanent forum of the United Nations, which is a huge success, especially for civil society. Okay. So, back to 2005 and the Tunis agenda. What is internet governance? So basically internet governance, as they defined it back then, was that governments, the private sector and civil society come together to develop shared principles, norms, rules and decision-making procedures and programs that shape the evolution and use of the internet. That sounds very broad. And the German party, basically Democratic Party, took it very seriously, and they were like, okay, so what is at stake? Not just stakeholders, but the big debate was really between the multilateral approach of the International Telecommunications Union or the more multi-stakeholder open model by ICANN. And that was really the big power debate back then, and it still is an ongoing debate and fight. So, the Internet Governance Forum, I already talked a lot about it. It's basically a platform where you can discuss public policy issues related to internet governance. And it's a place of inspiration. There are no decisions made there, but they are holding an annual conference. It happens all around the world. The last one was, for example, in Norway this year. And there's also actually a lot of intersessional work going on, which I can highly recommend. So it's not just this one conference, but also, for example, you can join dynamic coalitions or policy networks on different topics surrounding internet governance, where you can actively participate and exchange opinions with different stakeholders and perspectives. And what's really important is really national and regional initiatives. So, for example, there's the European Dialogue on Internet Governance, which will happen next year in May in Brussels. And actually, maybe for the train home, if you have any ideas that you would like to discuss at the European level, then the call for issues for our Eurodic actually ends tomorrow, so feel free to submit something. And then there's also the German Internet Governance Forum, so the IGFD. And it has its annual meeting usually in Berlin. And as you can see in the picture, that's from the German Internet Governance Forum in 2023, there's still a lot of space in the room for all of you, so please show up there and engage in the German Internet Governance Forum. And yeah, I already told you that Carsten Wildberger, the German Minister for Digital, was in New York to deliver a speech at the UN General Assembly. And then German news media obviously picked that up because that's a big thing. And it was his first speech at the United Nations. But they mainly emphasized the free internet. And it was really cool because the German government is giving 1 million euros to the Internet Governance Forum, which is a great achievement and amazing. However, I think that it's kind of like one-sided to only say, okay, we need a free internet, because it's so much more than that. It should be open, it should be secure, it should be global, it should be interoperable. There are so many more things that the internet should be, not just free. So as you can see, there are so many problems, not just 99 problems, but so many more. And I think one of the biggest issues when it comes to internet governance is really digital divides. So back in the day, the UN Secretary General, who basically founded the Internet Governance Forum, Kofi Annan, said, we need to develop inclusive and participatory models of governance. The medium must be made accessible and responsive to the needs of all the world's people. And this is definitely not true today. There are still 26% approximately, according to the ITU, of people who are offline. So that's a huge digital divide. And then you can also add layers of geography, of gender, of race, of other forms of marginalization where people simply cannot connect and can't take part in the digital. And now, back to the timeline, there was another year of fate where a lot was going on in internet governance, and that was 2013. The Snowden revelations, surveillance, all around the world. And there, the Brazilian government was like, okay, we need to do something about this. And they assembled stakeholders back then in Brazil, and we're like, okay, we're doing a conference that is called Net Mundial, which determines that internet governance should be more inclusive. So they did that. They invited all kinds of stakeholders and really reacted to this huge surveillance drama. And then 10 years later, there was actually a revival happening with Net Mundial +10, where they all assembled again 10 years later and now developed the Sao Paulo multi-stakeholder guidelines, which are really, really essential to make the IGF, the Internet Governance Forum, but also other bodies more inclusive and more multi-stakeholder. And then another year of fate, because not just Net Mundial +10 happened in 2024, but also the Global Digital Compact. Sounds huge, but basically was just an annex of a document that was published at, or came out of the Summit of the Future that happened last year. And yeah, Antonio Guterres was basically behind the Global Digital Compact. So he said, we must come together around a Global Digital Compact to avoid fragmentation, safeguard human rights, and ensure technology is a force for human well-being, solidarity, and progress. Sounds very big, however, there was still WSIS going on, right? This entire process, and then there was basically a parallel process with the Global Digital Compact, and it was very hard to, especially for civil society, to negotiate into this, that this is related to the Sustainable Development Goals and also the World Summit on Information Society. So basically the problem of fragmentation showed up. So there's not just internet fragmentation from a technical side, but also governance fragmentation. Because as a civil society organization, it's very hard to go to every conference, to follow every process that is going on at the same time in internet governance. And governments and companies can maybe afford that, but it's also a way to distract other stakeholders. So there is a lot of also institutional competition within the United Nations for who actually governs the internet, who's responsible for digital governance, and especially when it comes to AI governance. Basically, no one really knows what's going on. And there's a lot of very good academic literature also about the multi-stakeholder approach and how it's sometimes theater, it's sometimes very performative, how multi-stakeholderism works and how it might be a belief, and you actually have to put this fiction into practice. So, who actually runs the internet? Who actually holds the power? That's mainly with organizations that are doing standards and norms. So, we're starting with the International Telecommunications Union and the International Organization for Standardization. So I'll focus on the ITU, so the International Telecommunications Union. That's a very multilateral organization, so stakeholders are not really allowed inside the room. And for example, there's the ITU Council Working Group on WSIS and the SDGs, so World Summit on Information Society and the Sustainable Development Goals. And out of this working group, the working group for internet-related public policy issues was developed, so the CWG Internet. And I think that's one of the coolest working groups of the ITU, because the consultations are actually open to all stakeholders. So all of you, if you have any ideas about the development of the internet, you can just participate. You can go to Geneva or even also participate online and just basically share your opinion on the topics that are suggested. And topics in the past were expanding internet connectivity, bridging the gender-digital divide, or also challenges and best practices for the design, installation, operation of internet exchange points. That's a topic very close to my heart, so that's why I really like this consultation. And yeah, with the German Youth IGF that I'm also part of, we regularly participate in those consultations. So we're always just, basically showing up there, telling member states what our opinion is as the youth, and they have to listen to us, so that's pretty nice. Okay, then the next list of abbreviations is the Internet Engineering Task Force, and the Internet Architecture Board, and the Internet Research Task Force. I'll now, for now, focus on the Internet Engineering Task Force. I would consider them technical community, and they really define how protocols and standards enable computers and networks to communicate with each other. And I think they're best known for standardizing the protocol HTTP. And how they function and work is, I think, really interesting, because it's really rough consensus and running code. So you have to be, or have a lot of technical knowledge to really be part of this. And they actually decide on things. Often a chair of a working group just checks in by humming. So they all hum together, and then you can see whether there's a consensus developing or not. And I can only recommend you to read the case study on the IETF by Dr. Corinne Kaff, which is really, really cool and interesting, but also a bit shocking, which is, I think the title already says a lot: Loud Men Talking Loudly, Exclusionary Cultures of Internet Governance. And then we also have the World Wide Web Consortium, then also the IEEE, which is the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineering, or engineers, and then you also have the Unicode Consortium, but I'll focus on the W3C for now. And those are really multi-stakeholder standards bodies. So they really define how the internet works in technical specifications and guidelines. And they've actually developed HTML. And Sir Tim Berners-Lee, who's really behind the W3C, actually invented the World Wide Web by combining hypertext, TCP, and the domain name system. And speaking of the domain name system, one of my favorite topics, we have ICANN and IANA. So ICANN is the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, then IANA is the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority. So ICANN really manages internet addresses and ensures that every IP address around the world is unique. And each country is responsible for its own country code top-level domain, so CCTLD. So that's, for example, DENIC for .de in Germany. However, there's also a new round going on, an applicant round. So if you have any idea for a generic top-level domain that you would like to register, you can just apply if you have, I think, $227,000. A little, yeah, that's a lot, and that's only the minimum. But yeah, this new generic top-level domain round will basically start next year, so you can apply. And I think I saw some posters around at the Congress that some people would like to register .meow, so good luck with that. That would be really cute. And then we also have IANA, which is really important. That was basically the address book back in the days that John Postel had in his home in California, where he had all IP addresses around the world, but at some point an organization finally took over. And yeah, the IANA stewardship transition, because the stewardship of IANA was in the hands of the Department of Commerce, so the US government, and this transition only happened or was fulfilled or ended in 2016, so very late. And then the BBC wrote, has the US just given away the internet? Yes, that happened, and that's only a couple of years ago. And then we also have regional internet registries, so RIRs. They are managing critical internet resources, so mainly numbers, and we, I think, all know the fight between IPv4 and IPv6, and that there should be a transition to a more secure IPv6. However, there's still a lot of IPv4 addresses floating around the internet, and they are also more valuable because they are more rare and they are really a critical resource, so that's a huge issue. And in Europe, RIPE NCC is responsible for distributing numbers. However, on the African continent, it's Afrinic. And there's a huge crisis going on there right now. There are a couple of articles. I think Monica Amat wrote a very good article in Heise on this, that there's really this battle over Africa's internet resources, so IP addresses. And there's one individual who stirred a huge controversy by amassing really more than 10 million IPv4 addresses and then leasing them out to companies outside of the African continent. And basically African service providers were like, oh, what the hell? What's going on? And they didn't get any IP addresses anymore. So just imagine this. The internet in Africa the development of the internet in Africa was really hindered and stomped by this. And Afrinic is just an organization that is based in Mauritius, but right now it's really facing a huge governance crisis. And that's a huge problem because this really hinders the development of the internet. And this also already leads me to injustices. I've already touched upon a few, but there are so many huge injustices in internet governance. So just as an example, the IPv4 scarcity on the African continent and the African internet address space, but also, for example, that the majority of Internet Engineering Task Force documents are actually originating from North America and Europe. And then also, in most of the bodies that I named, women's participation is very low. I now picked out ICANN, but I think it could be improved everywhere, that there's just more diversity in those bodies and more perspectives are represented. And then the huge question also for me is, who actually owns the infrastructure of the internet? Like, for example, submarine cables or satellites. But that's more of an open question and a question for another talk, I think. I don't have enough time for this. But all of this really replicates colonial and patriarchal models of hierarchy. And I can only really, really highly recommend you to watch the talk by Esther Mwemwa, The Cosmology of Internet Infrastructure, that she gave at the Republica this year. And I think she also references the map that I'm showing there of the Eastern Telegraph, that internet cables, especially subsea cables, really replicate colonial continuities because, yeah, it all just stayed the same. The power imbalances are still there that were there in colonial times. So now, what is the future of internet governance? How will things continue? What is going to happen next? So the main, big, huge achievement is really WSIS. So WSIS+20 review. Because there was a consensus resolution, and this is huge. Literally member states of the United Nations that are at war, at conflicts with each other, agreed on something, which is amazing, and on something related to the internet, which is even more amazing. So that's really a huge thing, especially for civil society. And then on the negative side, the huge debate at the WSIS+20 review was really the government involvement in the IGF. So the IGF is really supposed to be very open, all stakeholders should participate, but then it was always, oh yeah, there should be another track for this group, another track for that group, another track for government, but this would just lead to separate rooms and to more fragmentation, that people don't really sit at the table with each other anymore, but in separate rooms, and that a lot of backdoor deals obviously happen. Then another huge issue is AI governance. So actually the WSIS action lines are supposed to be tech neutral, so just be adapted to all technologies, but AI governance is a huge different chunk of things happening, and also the G7 is doing a lot on AI governance, the OECD is doing a lot, but for example, countries like Lesotho are not in the G7 or not in the G20 or also not in the OECD, and they can't partake in those discussions, and that's why the Intergovernance Forum is really the place for them to actually negotiate their own positions. And that's really the only space where they can present their opinions. And then another very negative thing is that really the financial mechanisms remain unclear. So it's very unclear how the IGF will be secured in the future. The German government fortunately is contributing €1 million to the IGF now, but that's definitely not enough because it's a conference that is free of charge. So yeah, that's very unclear. On a positive side, we have a permanent intergovernance forum, and that's a huge success because otherwise it was always very unstable and unclear whether the mandate would be prolonged or not. And then also following up on that, national and regional initiatives are now really recognized in the text, which is also a huge success because organizations and basically for that, like the German Intergovernance Forum, but also the European Dialogue on Intergovernance are now formally recognized, and we can now go to governments and be like, hey, you recognize this, maybe you should be part of this and engage more, and even also say that to companies, so that's really amazing. And then also one huge chunk of things was really that there should be more coherence with the Sustainable Development Goals and with the Global Digital Compact. So that was really also a huge issue because there are so many different parallel structures happening. And especially for civil society, it's just very hard to follow all of this and everything that is going on. So those linkages are really, really important. So what is next for all of you? Basically, you can engage. What can you do? And I think it's really, really worthwhile to consider to travel to an intergovernance forum, to take part and participate in the German IGF. And as I said, there is a call for issues going on at the moment for the European Dialogue on Internet Governance. So that's really, really amazing. You can just feel free to submit your proposal. Maybe on the train home you still have some ideas. So that's really cool. And then also another organization that I can only recommend is the Internet Society. They are also doing really, really amazing work to also improve the diversity in all of those standardization bodies. And yeah, there's also, for example, a German chapter of the Internet Society. So I think there are so many ways in which one could improve all of those structures. And then the next point is you can all participate. You can all ask, for example, your employer to send you to a conference that you're really passionate about. For example, going to an ICANN conference, etc. So I think that's a nice way. If your employer says, no, we don't have money for that, then there are fellowships out there. There are so many different pathways to get into internet governance. For example, the German government has the Fellowship for International Digital Policy. And then ICANN also has 2 different fellowships. So there's one fellowship for people who are already more advanced and already kind of have a foot in the door. But then there's also Next Gen Fellowship for ICANN, which I did this year, and I learned so much about the domain name system. It was really fascinating. And if you're between 18 and 30 years old, you can just apply and then you travel to an ICANN conference and just learn how they work. And then also Internet Society has a lot of different fellowships. For example, they have an early career fellowship, but also a policymaker program, which is also really fascinating, where you really learn about the policy and human rights side of things. So I can only highly recommend all of this. And last but not least, with internet governance and everything going on at the same time, the most important thing is to stay informed. So there are so many different mailing lists by different working groups of the IETF, of the World Wide Web Consortium, of ICANN, where you can just sign up and participate in a policy process, like a PDP, policy development program process at ICANN, but also at different working groups within the IETF. And I can only really highly recommend you to engage there. And then there are also so many newsletters out there in the world, so you can just search for internet governance newsletters. But my biggest recommendation, I think, of today, I think you should all sign up for this, is the Internet Governance Forum Germany community list. because also sometimes the German government, but also other stakeholder groups like the technical community or civil society regularly post things on this list, so the IGFD community list, to keep each other informed and engage with each other. So also about all events going on in Germany on internet governance, you can be informed via this. So huge recommendation to sign up. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sophia. We still have almost 15 minutes for questions. Are there any questions? If so, please help yourself to the microphone and I will call you by your number. I think I can't see your number, but it's microphone number 3, please.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. I'm part of the RIPE community. I'm the co-chair of the Working Group Connect. And I'm wondering, so first of all, the RIPE community also deals with the operations of what's happening in the internet, which is a really good big part. And it's also open, so you can also participate there if you're like more interested in the technical way. My question is then, how much of the operation people do we see in the IGF meetups, and should we move our ass more to go there?
That's a fantastic question. Thank you very much, and I'm glad to know that you're part of the RIPE community. Genuinely, yes, definitely participate. The IGF, I think, is a very inclusive space, but I think that especially technical perspectives are often lacking. So definitely travel there, and I think it's very, very important to just talk to other stakeholders and to just check what they're up to and what their opinions are, and to really have those interdisciplinary conversations where you have the technical community talking to civil society, talking to governments, and basically everyone talking to each other. So genuinely, yes, for sure. Thank you.
All right, then number 1, please.
Yes, thank you very much for your talk. The whole process is a huge power struggle, obviously. And what kind of power struggles do you foresee for the future? I mean, there are special issues we are fighting for right now, and where you would need participation?
I think the biggest power struggle is really multilateral versus multi-stakeholder. So to keep the rooms open and to keep everyone at the table, I think that's the biggest debate, because especially the group that negotiated for the G77 plus China, so mainly the global majority, they were really pushing for the multilateral approach. And we're like, no, we need closed doors. We need to keep this inside the room. We need to really, keep other stakeholders out. So I think that's the biggest power struggle, to really keep this ongoing. So thank you very much for this question.
All right, quick question. Are there questions from the internet?
Yes, there are. One is when the telephone or internet was invented, there were no standards. And the question is, isn't it kind of a natural part of all this that the technology drives actually creating the de facto standards?
Yes, I think it might be natural, but it's still not inclusive. And it's also a very political thing, because I think that's sometimes the issue, that sometimes it's not even recognized that the internet is a political place, and that what happens on a technical level, like for example with the chat control, is actually really political and is going to surveil us all. So I think it might be natural, but I think we should definitely push against this and not necessarily politicize it, but genuinely also look at it from a human rights perspective, from a democratic perspective. So for sure, but really good question. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe also to add to that, something to make really clear that we have a lot of policies made by governments that are rather, I would say, local for Europe, for the US, while everything that is standardization and internet is global. So there's also a lot of power there to shape our digital lives, to add to Sophia. And then number 4, please.
Yeah, my question was basically already given in the first question, but some comment about the IETF and diversity. I'm a IETF contributor, and there are a lot of programs by the IETF itself to increase diversity. There's a diversity travel grant, there are fee waiver programs, and if you're certified to be a student, you can get very cheaply, even cheaper than Congress, I think. And yeah, next summer the IETF meeting is in Vienna, so not that far. So if anyone is interested in participating, please come by.
Woo. Thank you very much. That's amazing.
I think we are still at number 4.
First of all, thank you for your talk, and especially for trying to motivate, especially younger people to get into this. And this seems like one of those low-level entry opportunities where one could actually have huge impact. So thank you for pointing that out. My question is, in one of the very first slides, you mentioned that the WSIS is taking care of what they call the free internet, and I was wondering whether free is freely accessible or freely non-censored, or if it's free as in it doesn't cost anything, money.
I think the first thing you said applies more to that, not that it doesn't cost anything, to be honest, but I think we should also push for more open knowledge. And yeah, genuinely, I think because the language, especially in those documents, whether it's the Global Digital Compact or also the WSIS resolutions, is framed in a very open way. You can also just interpret it in this way and be like, hey, free means for free, and go to the government, to companies, and be like, hey, you committed to this, you signed this and this, and yeah, push for that, and for more free software, for example. So very good point, but I think that's always a matter of interpretation that we can also use for ourselves, obviously.
Sure, thank you.
Do we have another question from the internet? I guess so.
Yes, we do. And why do you think non-male participation is low in the internet governance? And what can we do to change it?
I think in the entire technology sector, participation is very unjust. And it's genuinely very male-dominated. And I think it's often linked to, I think Khaleesi actually can say a lot more about this, how it is maybe to be a feminist and a very, outspoken woman in all of those more technical spaces, because I'm from a policy background. But I think that it's just a very exclusionary culture. So if you're new to a space, if you show up, then it's often not as open, and people don't welcome you and are like, hey, it's so cool that you're here, you can do this and this and this. It's more like, who are you? And this skepticism. So you first kind of have to prove yourself, and it's organized in a very meritocratic way, which also is historically very unjust. So that's my take on that.
Maybe we can rephrase the question a little bit, because I think one goal of your talk was to empower non-male persons to participate more in the standardization processes. And as a person, as you said yourself, with a non-technical background, entering this space, what would you tell your younger self when starting to enter the space, besides ignoring the dude saying, just because you don't run everything from the command line, you can't participate? I think this is one important takeaway for everyone to have. This happened to me as well. So,
Yeah, how I dealt with that. I mean, my story is that I applied for a fellowship to travel to the Internet Governance Forum in Ethiopia, and I was more interested in the trip of going to Ethiopia rather than the internet part, to be honest. And then I basically sat there in the room and was like, okay, everyone is discussing the internet. I'm not really sure what it is, network of networks, something like that. I've never really run a code. But then the conversations were actually super, super cool, and I saw so many, especially feminist, and in that case also Afrofuturist organizations that were kind of politicizing this topic and kind of also talked about topics that I really deeply care about, for example, global justice. So that's how I got into it. And then I was like, okay, there's actually a lot of power within this. And if you just show up, so that was kind of my take, I just continued with that. And I was like, okay, we need to actually open doors. And that's, I think, what I would also consider my job as, to really open those spaces and open those doors that were sometimes also even closed for me, where I always had to knock and be like, hey, let me in, explain this to me. And I think also one thing is the abbreviations. I already had so many abbreviations in this presentation, but there are so many more. And just to, for example, if talks are given, if you talk to people who are especially newbies, who are new to the spaces, that you explain all of this for them. And I think that's already a way of making people feel more welcome, right? But otherwise, I think my biggest advice is just to show up.
Show up and keep showing up, no matter how hard it is. I know that it's hard. There's another question at microphone 4.
Yeah, again, thank you for the presentation and spreading the awareness. My question is, in general, the internet is, let's say, more towards left, though it's changing, right? When it has been in the years that I've been growing up. So, but now we increasingly see there are more far-right governments that are coming up, groups that are coming up, social media that is also going more towards right. At the policy level, is there any initiative that is being done? And let's say if there are more governments that are moving towards right all over the world, will this kind of policy, something at the policy level could be done, or people can get control to keep it left or move it more towards left, or at least maintain the balance? I'm sorry if it's not in your, not in the area of interest for you, but maybe, yeah, this is...
Oh, that's most definitely in my area of interest, for sure. And I also wouldn't argue that the internet was always necessarily leftist, to be honest. And I think what we're seeing right now, especially with the bro-oligarchs and with the tech billionaires that I mentioned in the beginning, and also what's going on in the United States of America, then, yeah, we have to do something about this. And you can also notice this within the negotiations, for example, when it comes to WSIS, within the IGF, but also within all of those standards bodies. For example, especially as an example with WSIS, the US government didn't want to sign the resolution because there was talk about the Sustainable Development Goals, and they don't agree with the Sustainable Development Goals, and they don't care about gender, or they don't want the language in that, or the word. So yeah, we have to do stuff about this, and yeah, to keep it shifting to the right. And for example, on a European Union level, there's a lot going on in this, especially in the context of disinformation. For example, the European Union has the European Democracy Shield, but all of those things and all of those policies and initiatives are just words, right? We have to fill them with something, with life. So I can only encourage, especially people coming from technical backgrounds, to inform themselves more on that, and really to, yeah, advocate for the internet not being completely taken over by AI slob and tech billionaires. But thank you for the question.
Thank you. Is there another question from the internet? I guess so.
Yes, there is. What are your thoughts about speculations that the IETF has been influenced by certain government agencies to design weaker internet security standards, and how do we fight against it?
Wow, that's a very interesting question that I don't think I can necessarily answer because I'm not too deeply immersed into what the IETF is doing. But yeah, of course, they're pushed from different governments to also send their own people and to push for their own agenda. But just like that, the same is happening with big tech companies that, yeah, because the IETF just participating there is very expensive. They are meeting 3 times a year all around the world. You have to fly there, you have to afford the hotel costs. So I think that's one way of also keeping it exclusive. And yeah, for sure. And I think how we push against that is, again, the same thing that I said in the beginning, is really showing up, by going there, by asking questions, by showing up to those spaces, whether it's about the security of the internet, but also other things like inclusivity.
All right, we have 2 more minutes, so one more question from, I think you're number 4, right? Yeah.
Hi. You had this one picture of how many % of the world is not online and how many are online. And I think 1/4 you said was offline. And I wanted to ask if in this 1/4 also like countries where there is censorship, but technically it's possible to go online, or like when you have like only like in countries 2 hours of
Electricity?
Yes, thank you, electricity. If this counts as online or offline, you know what I mean?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think for the International Telecommunications Union, it's also very hard to estimate how people are actually unconnected. I'm not sure about this particular data with the 26% that are offline, but genuinely, internet shutdowns are also part of that, obviously, and also electricity, because in a lot of countries, especially also in the African continent, we have load shedding, yeah. So there's no electricity, which also means that you can't really access all of your devices. But yeah, I would have to look more deeply into that and research the number. Thank you.
So I would finish us up for now. Sophia, if people have questions, where can they find you after the talk?
It's all on the, basically I'll still, I think, stick around or like go to the front of the room. Otherwise, you can also please write me an email or send me a message via Mastodon or Blue Sky. I'm really happy to discuss all of those topics. And I'm so happy that so many people showed up for internet governance. Like, this is amazing.
Thank you very much.